start our recording. For context for folks that may be new, we started recording our governance sessions back in 2022, and we have an own cloud with, we just posted it to the forum, where you can review both past recordings for a number of our calls, as well as some of the presentation materials that have been provided. So those are both available on the own cloud link that's posted on the forum. And if you don't consent to being recorded, I just ask that you drop off now and you follow up with the recording at a later date. So in thinking about the governance, so housekeeping, I think we're going to follow up with a governance session depending on how far along we get today. But for the folks that joined for profiling, I apologize. We will get to the technical heart of the matter 2 sessions from now. Mike and I thought it would be helpful for this governance call to try to summarize where, like, we've been working on a working deck since, I want to say, I don't know, February. And really, as a result of the announcements that are coming out in our community about emerging initiatives with the Pan-Canadian Data Model and the CA Core, but ultimately to try to work through in a logical manner some of our concerns using structured questions and exercises to try to pick apart, is there an objective right way forward as we look at how the baseline should relate to national guides, and from both a technical conformance artifact perspective as well as a community perspective. And so I've taken essentially the long working deck that's posted on our own cloud and tried to summarize it into these 5 slides that go over these topic areas to arrive at and provide the kind of logical background for a set of recommendations that I think we want to go through today and validate. Did we understand and synthesize what was discussed and desired correctly, so that we can kind of get out of this kind of rumination phase and onto tackling tangible next steps for us to execute on these recommendations. And so for folks that may be new to the calls, I think really what we've been looking at is trying to figure out, as a grassroots group that has established a set of conformance artifacts that have kind of gone through a number of refinements and comparison to the FHIR implementations that are out there today, how do we handle that given that we have a completely volunteer grassroots governance structure when we have, more formalized governance structures beginning to form that pursue these end goals? And I think one question, or I guess one helpful historical piece, is that, when we started the baseline efforts, we had always said, okay, we know that, we started looking at like the US core and saw what they were able to accomplish with their profiles, but we knew we had to take a slightly different approach because we didn't have the teeth or the bite to enforce some of the expectations and requirements in our iGuides and in our vendors. But there was always a thread of desiring for the rules that we're putting into place to eventually be able to, evolve and inform a core equivalent, something that would be able to go further than the baseline could go in its current principles. And so, when we try to think through, okay, this time is kind of occurring, it's occurring faster than we anticipated. What does that mean for our conformance artifacts? What should that mean for our community? We first started with kind of that question of like, do our goals and our intents behind the baseline, like, is there a need to continue maintaining and progressing it if, for instance, the rules and the principles were subsumed by a new artifact or by a new implementation guide? And trying to examine this from the technical and communal aspect, because that was something that came out time and time again in our last set of conversations over the last 3-4 months. We tried to then kind of look at how does the scoping of each guide impact that assessment. So like, if we are attempting to be a use case agnostic, set of profiles, and we're trying to determine what would the best relationship look like if we had a set of national use case profiles that were also use case agnostic or that were domain specific, and examining cons or the risks and the benefits that come along with those pairings. And then we looked back at our options, right? So when we first started like talking to the community and saying, okay, we're ready and we're at this kind of trial maturity 1, and we're ready for other implementation guides to start claiming their relationship to us. We outlined as part of our governance stream a number of different technical options that would be available to incorporate into our asks for effectively like making claims. And so we looked at, specifically what are these options that we have available to us within this relationship, right? The relationship going upwards to a national guide. And what are the specific impacts and considerations around specifically derivation was one of the first things that we looked at. When the goal being that when you put all of these things together and we look at all of our conversation points and what folks have expressed, we should be able to go through and compile that into a set of, okay, if it looks like this is kind of what we're recommending. This is a safe kind of steps forward to act as essentially collaborators rather than competitors in this community. And so I see a number of new names on the call. I have these summarized slides. We can talk through some of the main themes before talking like a little bit later about the things that we want to work on. But I know that for folks that have been kind of going through this since January with us, it may be a little bit repetitive. Is anyone opposed to us just touching on some of the high level themes? Does anyone have questions before we go into any of, it's really just like, I think 4 setups just to orient you folks. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think particularly if we're recording, it provides useful context if somebody picks up this recording and watches it.
Yep. I think I would agree. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not I don't know. I came in late. Yes, we are recording.
Yes, we are recording. Yep. All right. Okay. So one of the first questions that we asked is like, do we need to, like, under what conditions do we maintain the baseline? Under what conditions is mutual exclusivity needed? And like, what are the conditions that contribute to that? To examine, what effectively do we need to consider maintaining versus kind of allowing to evolve into something else. And so some of the really key themes that came out in these discussions around, do we continue evolving the baseline or not, was really dependent on how we considered the scope of our own guide and how we considered the scope of, we'll call it like a target guide. When we look at what patterns exist in the community, particularly for like bases, the drive was always to be use case agnostic in scope. And we have developed a process that allows for us to remove aspects that we initially included as constraints or requirements that we identify through looking and comparing other guides in our community, and identifying we may have gone a little bit too far. We may have included things that work for a handful of use cases, but not across the board. And so having a good assessment of how use case agnostic are we today, and does the CA core or another national guide in our environment, if it claims use case agnosticism, how does that impact the shakeup? One thing that was really, really clear, and I think Paul Knapp was really helpful in kind of pointing this out, which was, as just good practice, not just from a governance, but from a technical perspective, we should be seeking to reduce redundancy and duplication. And so we had to think about the scoping from that perspective as well. Because effectively, like if we're proliferating, but we are one-to-one for another set of constraints and expectations in our community, all we're doing is watering down the ability for folks to understand what we're asking for, and we're creating potential points of failure if those change in the future. And so getting the scope right and knowing that we got that kind of true use case agnosticism was going to be a really key function of what next steps we recommend. I think a big piece, and Lorraine, I think like you have been a big advocate on this front, which is around beyond just we have a source that we can go to that provides our community of authors some consistency. we also operate as a community. So there are values to being a group that meets every Friday through the FHIR Implementers Group, where we share business and technical information on, the projects that we're working on, best practices that we're employing, questions that we have, and that allows us to coordinate with our peers and builds our capacity in our community in FHIR. And so we can't, I'm a very technical person, and I think sometimes I think about this just like what do the layers look like? But this is a really important piece that the community wants to be considered as part of the next steps. And that, I think through and through again, when we looked at the combinations of, well, if we're scoped this way and a core is scoped this way, I think one thing that came up was this, we want to feel confident in the process, but also, there are some passive benefits that we get as a community that meets, where, we may want to consider if the baseline retires its conformance artifacts eventually, how do we try to keep as many of those benefits as we can that we gain socially on calls together. And so this is our the scoping kind of.
Well, it's not just the social thing.
So social meaning like the business, the context, the community building is a shorthand. Were you thinking?
Well, yeah, there's the community building, but there's also the manifestation of business policy that's consistent, and the coordinating of consistency across. Because we don't want to end up where we end up with V3 with 13 different variations of the same standard. So our goal is always to not be there. I must admit, I don't understand the difference between core and core plus, but that's just an aside.
I believe core is the base profiles, and the plus part is the domain level profiles.
Okay, I thought baseline was the base profile, so that's where I missed my understanding. So that's okay. Let's just keep going.
From what was described on Tuesday, I understood this was the baseline and core was. So that was just my understanding.
Sorry, Randy, you broke up just a little bit.
So from that meeting on Friday, I understood it was the reverse. Core plus was essentially in the core.
You're falling off.
We can circle back to it, but yeah, I think going back to the source of truth and looking at, I've included core plus here because it's how it's being, well, I guess I should probably modify this, but in our thought exercises, I think what we were trying to isolate was if a national guide came out and had a similar or same scope, what would be the impact in our recommendation given the scope of the CA baseline? And I see, okay, yep, Brandy, thanks for putting that in chat. And we also looked at, okay, how do these permutations have a, at what point do our decisions and our recommendations change based on the variable of the permutation? So we looked at, if we're claiming, okay, the CA baseline as it stands is as close to use case agnostic as our principles allow, and the CA core or another national guide came in that was similarly scoped, it was use case agnostic in the same way. The group felt if it's basically being consumed and there is that secondary trust in the process and the kind of transparency and the community input, then there isn't as much concerns about the baseline retiring, other than that passive benefits that we talked about. But the piece around, community engagement and trust being important for a number of these potential permutations. The other, combination that we looked at to try to say, okay, does this change anything, was if the CA baseline is use case agnostic and the CA core or another equivalent guide came in and essentially had the same constraints, but maybe strengthened them, applied additional desired constraints, but still maintained its use case agnosticism. But ultimately our feelings were the same, which was if they were scoped similarly and the principles were appropriate, that the CA baseline could retire because effectively it would be a duplicative guide. The last piece that we started to talk through the last time we were on a conformance call together, but didn't have a ton of time to talk through. I think it's probably the most likely, given what we've heard so far, which is there is a shared, basically a shared set of expectations and constraints between a CA baseline, but a CA core, CA plus wasn't fully use case agnostic. It shared what was in the baseline and then extended it because, for instance, there was a domain that they were looking at applying constraints in. I think the important thing to consider with this combination is that just like how we had started trying to say, okay, from the patient access perspective, starting with a set of constraints and then whittling back to come to this use case agnostic conclusion, it's possible that the CA core plus will do the same, right? And so I think we have to think through, okay, during the period where it is like this, what is our recommended approach? And then if that continues to change, and for instance, if they developed maybe a stronger but still use case agnostic set of artifacts through this process, what that transition would look like and how we would transition from kind of one approach to the other. So I put something for people to react to, which is, the same variable, assuming that we have trust in the process, but there is this kind of additional scope introduced. What do folks think? I mean, are we far off here by saying, well, the CA baseline remains for its consistency practices, but we'd probably have to modify some things about our approach. And we definitely would need to ensure that from a communication standpoint, that we were trying to push anyone who would be applicably covered by a core or another national guide that's in play to go there directly, so as to avoid necessarily having folks get out of sync with the implementation guide that was actually most appropriate for their scope of coverage. So I've highlighted as a to be validated. Is this the conclusion that folks were coming to? Is there a modification to this based on this this additional variable?
I don't think our experience to date has borne that out. That's my concern.
So let's refine it. So when you're thinking has borne it out, you mean
for instance, the CA core patient and the baseline patient are different enough that's creating diversion in the environment I'm in. And that's partly because the CA core was based on a specific use case. So the CA core isn't use case agnostic. And that's my concern.
There isn't a CA core yet.
Okay, well, we published stuff that we've called CA core and told people to inherit from it. We've also told other people to inherit from CA baseline, and now we're getting conflicts.
So effectively, when we first started 3 years ago, we had published in our project core, basically CA FHIR baseline and then core. And then through the process of developing our principles, had established that we could not act like we tried to define what is base, what's baseline, what's core, that we couldn't actually kind of self-attest our artifacts as being core because they didn't really match with the level of strength and constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So as we publish more and more versions, I think what you're saying is if folks tied to one of the very early versions, that now if you're looking at the newest version package, there are differences.
Well, there's differences between what's being published, which is really within the IP, the CAPS, whatever we're calling it, which some of which is what's in there is consistent with the baseline, but not all of it.
Yeah.
And we're getting inconsistent direction because what's in there is not net, which is being called CA core, but is somewhat use case specific, which is appropriate for within that individual package, but we're not really being clear about
Yeah.
how we're
I want to address that, but
communicating.
Ron, I see that you've got your hand up.
Yeah, and I'll be interested in definitely how you address that. So here's what I sit on the as often as I can. It's not perfect. The U.S. Realm Steering Committee, and the challenge that they've had with CORE is that people. So there's one group of people that have evolved and are working through CORE, and changes occur, and definition gets done, and so okay, there they go, and then they say, okay, so another group comes along and says, okay, what have you got here? I need to go do this thing. I'm going to adopt what you have over here. And how would they know? Seriously, because there's not all perfect dialogue. There's not some kind of magic gestalt in sort of intersection of minds that occurs here. They look at a thing and they assume, oh, I am then constrained by this definition of this resource as core. Therefore, I have to develop an extension, or I have to do something else because the use case I have, yeah, that's not working for me. And so one of the challenges and one of the values, I still believe in this strongly, is that, and I don't care what we call it, baseline, whatever core. I remember when we were talking to Netherlands and they were describing their process when we were at the Henderson meeting, what I heard was that every single time someone comes to use their core, they do an assessment of has that utilization or has that use case, is it informing our definition of what is comprehensive in terms of our sort of a foundational piece of work, because they're very, very worried about duplication of existing models based upon the core specification that is not a use case agnostic as being the limiting factor in terms of what people can do in terms of their choices that they're making. The only way they would know that is if there was a use case agnostic, but agreed upon set of definitions as to the concepts in terms of their potential representations that exist. And they would go, oh, okay, I see. That's a constraint on this idea. I'm okay, because actually the concept that I want to have is there. And what's happened is that in the US realm, people are coming along, not finding that baseline kind of artifact, and then going ahead and coming back and creating a whole new artifact based upon that constrained artifact that actually is not what the US realm wants them to do, right? So they're having this problem. Do we create a whole new iteration of this thing that branches? How are we going to make this work? And really the whole problem came about because they didn't have that reference baseline. That people are
Yes.
looking at stuff that's in place and assuming, okay, I'm constrained by that. That's my limitation. And I'm sorry, as much as you can explain that to people, unless they have a thing they can look at that's easily, clearly distinguished, they're going to continue to be confused. And so I think that's my worry. And I've lived this experience way before FHIR, way before any other things when you do anything in terms of creating, for example, a data dictionary, and when you start to create instances from that data dictionary, I've lived this before. So it's really, really helpful to have that. The challenge that we have, Sheridan, is who's responsible for looking at what's happening in core, or will that be a process that exists in core, to always go back and test these assertions around a new use case comes along, and does this match our definition at a baseline level? Is it challenging that definition at a baseline level in terms of its comprehensiveness? Does it need to be expanded? Or are we looking at a situation where a person has made assumptions that this is all they've got to work with because of a previously constrained model, and we have the opportunity to educate them and say, no, it's okay. Take a look at this. This is really where you begin, and then you create your own constrained model based on the use case.
From my time on US Realm, because I was there when this particularly started coming up, US Core was actually use case specific. And they have serious problems because they don't have a baseline, and they've considered how they're going to get to the baseline. And I think the way we're starting out developing the core, because we're developing a use case at a time, I have concerns about the wasn't use case agnostic piece there. And, the fact that we're creating bifurcations that worry me. That's my only point.
Project teams doing work like that. What use case?
Are you, Ron, you walked away from your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I? thought
So
that was
I
in
just
the
want,
hip session.
I think I just touching on the use case agnostic.
Sure,
piece.
sorry.
So we have,
ahead.
I think, when we looked at what our approach would be, I think we have the same, ran into the same challenge, which is you can't necessarily claim something is use case agnostic until you have evidence from the community about what would be collectively shared across use cases, right? So I think we have to think about this from a, what happens if this configuration is the thing that happens first? What happens if it comes second? But ultimately, regardless of how it's tackled in the community, we should probably be able to say something that is use case agnostic, here's how it should operate with something that isn't, and here's how it should operate with something that is. Right? That's my thinking from the perspective of like, if we're trying to talk about the technical objective, right way forward, like regardless of the context, we should be able to answer that question.
I do agree, and I think that's a nice technical way to represent that. I think that's correct.
And so are folks in agreement or are they in disagreement when we say, if the baseline is this and it's use case agnostic and there isn't something else that's use case agnostic and we're looking at this, then it makes sense to continue pursuing our goals of trying to provide that as a starting point, while navigating the idea that we should be pushing folks to the guide that's most applicable to them if they are looking at employing a use case that has coverage. Is that something we agree with? Is it something that we don't agree with? Is there more detail?
So my technical answer and my business policy answer sort of are somewhat varied. I think right now in the environment we're in, my opinion is the baseline should remain. And hopefully we should try to inform and coordinate with CORE. One of the concerns I have right now is when you say we should try to push them to the environment that's most appropriate, is a mechanism to do that. And a mechanism to know what the domain specific work is going on and how to coordinate that. And I don't think we have that right now.
Okay, but I mean, if we're talking, all this is kind of future theoretical. So that would be something important then, like to have a clear mechanism that's available for us to do that.
Yep. And I think that would be that's going to be a foundational mechanism for any type of governance. And so, there's certain sets of precepts that need to exist, which is both concepts and also process related to those concepts that we haven't worked out yet. And I think many of us would have a pretty strong idea about what they need to be, but until we have a sense of how the governance model is going to be constructed, and based upon the last call we had, I think Joel was asserting that actually there is a model that's being developed. It's just not validated and surfaced yet. So I think Sheridan, I would say the rationale, the logic behind what you're doing here is really good. I think we need to wait and see what that looks like, what is proposed, and then test it against what you've described.
Okay. And then the last piece here was the kind of, I think, just carrying it out. Randy, you had brought this up last time that we hadn't touched on. What if there isn't anything in common, right? Do we feel like that has a different answer than there might be some evidence for remaining during a period and then, assessing? Does this get treated differently for any reason? Oh, so Thomas, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, just quick, sorry, not quick, just share my opinion here regarding thank you, Joanne, and for your distribution of this, the previous call about the say Core Plus, whatever, Core Plus. And actually just here, what I can say here is, it's a more like dancing. and it's dancing between the pay baseline and the core plus here. And right now, from this core plus side, they just start up
Mhm.
very, very early stage right now. They just give such announcement through that webinar. Haven't had a really details information, no matter the organization chart, no matter governance structure, no matter what kind of details about the relation, whatever. And from baseline perspective, we do have a very in-depth, understanding and work being done. We're a little bit, further away than the current core stage. So once go through dancing this kind of called metaphor, we have to see the two persons to collaborate to see what kind of way you can performance better. Now, I only observe, or I'm only observing right now, baseline side, this person try to collaborate or coordinate with the core plus. But however, from a core plus side, they just started. They're just learning and try to thinking what I should do right now. So there's no right or wrong. We can raise different kind of opinion thought here. And from my perspective, only just two cases here. One, baseline might incorporate and merge with the core, go to that common domain, or we stay separate, but we still have a very strong collaboration, interaction with the core, that a common domain. So that's just my two opinions, my thought here, but maybe there's extra third option there. But right now, we might not have too much information from the core plus to adjust our vision. There will be, but I better say there's quite lots of negotiation process. If you go back to the shared document there, they said, okay, leverage the baseline. So if they use a leverage, that means actually they still want to take some information from baseline to build or craft their core plus, which is the common domain there. So in that case, right now, we might give some time to the core business team to let them figure out what it is that they want to do. And also, if we really want to engage them, we might say, okay, this is what we have right now. If you really want to leverage from baseline, this is what we could offer. And so we could work together to build your common domain FHIR profile. So just stop here. Thank you.
I think that's really helpful to hear, Thomas, because I know there were, like, especially when we came out of February, like there were like concerns because we were facing ambiguity and the fact that things had just started. And so, we've been trying to kind of work through this of, okay, if folks are worried about that ambiguity, is there anything that we can do now? But, if we're feeling confident in the process and we're feeling like, okay, it's just early stages, I think the only thing to kind of think through is like, what are the mechanisms that we can offer up to try to reduce that confusion in our community, to indicate just what Thomas said, which is this is an evolving, the core is an evolving spec, and that we want to collaborate, stay in sync, and push our implementers towards that when the time comes. I have basically, I think the start of that, but I want to validate that with you folks, which is we know that the CA Core Plus is coming along. We know that there's going to be some work on specific domains, and that effectively, we need to stay in touch with that and aware so that folks can see, okay, we're developing this trust, we're seeing the process, we're engaging in the process, and then make that determination when we know it about whether or not, this is something where we have to, do something to our project or, make a modification. Yeah. But I think what I have been hearing is just, I think folks getting worried about the ambiguity, but wanting to make sure that, you know, they have that certainty once we get to the point of making the decision.
The thing I'd like to say is that, you know, maybe the team doesn't appreciate the level of maturity that's evolved out of your ongoing efforts around this. I mean, the way that you guys are thinking about baseline, the way that it was evolved, the due diligence associated with it is very mature. So it would only make sense that if something's just beginning and there's an assertion about it and there seems to be overlap, that yes, we would be anxious. What I would encourage you to remember is that your thinking is sound in terms of how you've gone about what you've done so far. There's tremendous value in it. And what we need to do is remain engaged so that we can assert that value as things arise. And when particular problems come up, for example, and you've already sort of figured that out through your baseline process, and that pops out, that will help validate that experience. So I just want to encourage all of you, you know, you're really way more mature in your thinking than you think. Perhaps certainly you're ahead of the curve in terms of the necessary governance to support you in terms of, or to support actually any of these things from an operational process, because governance is not just rules and it's just not ownership. There are processes that governance needs in terms of asserting, managing assets, making sure that continuity exists, coherence, consistency exists. These processes are there for a reason. And we don't have them yet, and we don't see them. But I can tell you this much: once they start getting asserted, you will know what your use cases are for it. I assure you. And don't hesitate about that. You know, you'll know that there are things that you'll need to do in order to be able to achieve the goals associated with the work, and those will be sound. That'll be based on sound reasoning. So I would encourage us to let this evolve a little bit further, but at the same time, expect and, if you will, challenge everyone to stay engaged and have this kind of thought process on an ongoing basis. But I think we're a little ahead of where the rest of the
I
things
agree,
are at.
and the work that this group's done is absolutely amazing. So I don't want to.
It is amazing. Yeah,
I don't want
it's
to I don't want to diminish that in any respect. I think some of the challenges I'm having. So we talked about CA Core Plus being announced. And we had a presentation on Tuesday to the HL7 community, and we've had some other presentations, but I'm not sure that equates to it being announced to the point of view of being visible to the stakeholders that all of us are trying to manage in terms of our managers and our vendors and our projects and all those other things. And I think the reason we're having some angst is that we've developed a relatively mature process amongst our group. And the process is still murky about what the definitions are, what is core plus, what is baseline, and what are the processes, and how do we actually effectively communicate those with our communities. And so that, I think that's one of the reasons why there's some stress on this.
So you're referring down here, right? Like, what do we do for the folks who may have already derived, or what do we do
No, I'm not. I mean, there's that is still definitely an issue. But for instance, an announcement about CA Core Plus, I think the first I saw it, I saw Randy sort of in the chat, I got distracted, was this past Tuesday. That's an announcement to, frankly, a relatively small community. How do we figure out what the appropriate communications channels are to our broader community so that we can support our projects and our vendors, et cetera? Where's the decision-making coming from? Because it doesn't, at this stage, feel like a community decision.
Well, I think there's some pieces of that we can take on as a community that's received some of this information to say, hey, it's early on. This is what we've heard so far. I think there's another part of it that will come out of the CA Core Plus announcements as their, I know they spoke to the terminology group, I think, or no, sorry, that was the roadmap. But like,
there
we
hasn't
don't
been a
have
formal
control
announcement.
over
They
all of
spoke
that
to our
announcement.
group, but they haven't announced anything.
Yeah.
I don't have an announcement I can give to my project manager.
And so I guess what I'm asking is, you know, and tying back to Randy's comment in the chat, what should the baseline do about that? What can the baseline do about that?
Yeah, I think the reason that we're frustrated is that probably there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, or like effectively, like, you know, you have some control over some things, but some things take time, right? Like, given how early it is, you know, we may not feel this way a month from now if information comes out and is shared this way, but like, as it stands now, like, we don't have control as a community to say, go faster, go faster, go faster, nor do I know if that's the right answer as a community. But I definitely think that the thing that we do have control over is how we act in the interim, and trying to act in a, you know, a collaborative and a proactive manner. And so, Randy, I know when you're in the chat, you said, you know, I can't figure out what to recommend. I can't recommend baseline report a day because, you know, so much of this is still undefined. And so I think we have to make a determination of, what do we tell people? Are we still asking them directly derive, claim in your claim this in your endorsement? I think
so. The
that's
challenge I have here is, and I'm all supportive of trying to be proactive and collaborative on this stuff. But so, for instance, the pieces about CA Core have been exposed to us and to the HL7 community call on Tuesday in a fairly narrow realm. So absent a more formal communication about the fact that this exists and is being thought about and is being developed, maybe even that it's, you know, not formed, but at least it exists. It's difficult for us to take it back to our stakeholders and our projects and our vendors and talk about it because nobody's heard about it. We're missing that communication layer. So we've been somewhat communicated with, and we're trying to manage it and do it up from above. But if I said CA Core Plus to anyone in the standards group at the Ministry of Health, the odds of them having heard of that term is small right now because we're early. So we're asking us to make recommendations and figure out how we're going to go forward when we don't have the top cover, I guess, is where I'm having the stress.
Do we think, so I'm just writing down here, like, we may need to wait for official announcements on the front when it comes to how we communicate to the folks that are either looking to utilize or that have already utilized, like getting our official statements in place, being able to share these resources. But I mean, can we at least, like, do we agree to these first three? Do we need to have an official press statement to be able to say, okay, this is what we're comfortable moving forward with, acknowledging that there's going to have to be some communication that goes out once we know a little bit more to our current implementers?
I mean, I think the work that's ongoing around core, like just having this essentially as a, you know, here's where we're at, and we've been doing that for a very long time, and there's been a great due diligence around this concept of baseline. We're very interested in contributing and also understanding the relative value propositions of the work that we've done so far, and whether that should continue on an ongoing basis. And just communicating that back into the exercise of core is very helpful. I do agree with Lorraine. And Randy, you know, I have great empathy for the fact that until that's somehow communicated at I would say an executive level, pretty much, in terms of the presence, the intention, the goals, and how that's going to evolve, it's very difficult to make any kind of recommendation. What you've got here is all the right things in terms of making a determination about how that should happen. But I think we're ahead of the curve here in terms of what's actually happening. I would just encourage us not to let go or abandon this. This is all extremely good work and good thinking, but we need to know when is the moment that we can say, oh, we're here now. Okay, listen, let's have this conversation, because I don't think we are actually there yet. I think there's still some things to be understood. And again, a proposed governance framework. A proposed governance framework, by the way, is one of those places where you're going to get senior level interest pretty quickly. Sorry, I'm laughing because I've encountered problems with this in the past, but government in general is very sensitized to the word governance. So as soon as that starts getting asserted at any kind of, level higher than just us as working teams, yeah, it'll get some attention. So I think that's when we'll probably have the opportunity. But in the meantime, I'm struggling as well, because again, things came to us as if they were fully formed, and I'm really understanding now that there's been a couple of use cases that have been considered, one significantly with a certain group of people, enough to validate requirements in terms of their approach, but not enough to necessarily socialize or scale, is what I'm thinking yet. So I think we need to just be patient, perhaps. But I think this is this is all correct thinking in terms of you're asking all the right questions.
So is this basically, is this where we stand, which is like, okay, like we will reevaluate once we have a little bit more information, whether or not we pursue, some of the steps below. And if it is, what would folks like? I am more than happy to leave this conversation on the table till we know more. I just feel like we keep getting pulled back into it, and then we got to get out of that rumination step.
So how broadly has CA Core Plus been announced?
I believe just to the HL7 community call and to our original call with the CA baseline. Folks, if you've heard it other places, I think we
If it was on CA baseline, I must have missed that baseline call. Yeah, so that's still a fairly narrow audience.
Okay. So just going back to that same question, like in the meantime, do we move forward with other governance activities? Are we comfortable just saying, hey, let's take a pause and a beat on this until we see more announcements come out in our ecosystem?
Just want to add in my thought again. Sorry. Hello?
Yeah, yep. Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, here, sorry, we're start point. Sorry, it's a little bit lost. Anyway, no matter baseline will away, the value, all those lesson learned experience will stay. That's my thought. And I can give you one example here. We all know HL7v3 is phasing out. Only the CDA, which generate V3, is stay. But actually, when I go back to look at a V3, I would say it's really the Bible from software engineering perspective. It's helped me lots, and still continue help me to understand this regime, whatever. So from baseline, I would say, instead, I do agree, we might need to stay tuned, waiting for the CA Core Plus, their call, and then we can make our reaction, or somehow. As what I said, we could per-action do some work, but that's just, depends on, I will say depends on situation. At the current phase, my opinions here, just stay tuned. But however, at the same time, we need to continue our baseline work. It doesn't mean status quo with the baseline work. We need to have some kind of a review process, make our baseline work more agile. And I would say from the previous week's the baseline call, I have said some kind of changes. Just like Shirley, you posted that on the info way about the R5, how to handle snowmass CT. That's a good start point. And also, there's another info way posted about immunization one, and which is feedback by the Lloyd. And I think, sorry for that, I cannot pronounce it probably about that gentleman, his name. It's also very good, case. And we need to incorporate or enrich our baseline work more and more. And also, another side, we all know that we would like to build a baseline, this is our original goal, based on our concept is use case agnostic. And what I heard before, at the very beginning of this baseline work, it's been built for implementation purpose. So if that's the case, we might need to go overview the baseline as quickly as possible to convert it or transform it from use case implementation style into use case agnostic style. But yes, I do agree, it's a tremendous work there, but we cannot just go everywhere. So we need to pick up a specific small group of resources. Patient definitely is the first one on my list. There might be quite lots of others for, being, raised by the community here. But we need to focus on small group of, resources, work on it, spearhead it, and make it normalized. And also with the most important part, Canadian flavor. That's very important. That's why we call it Canadian baseline. It's not called international baseline, it's Canadian baseline. Here, what I can say, or I can recall is sex gender. I know there's quite a lot of issues sex gender there. I do agree from R5. But in the R4, there's no such sex gender extension. I can only talk from, a technical perspective.
Oh, there is an extension in R4.
Yes, that's great. Add in. And I just posted that one and the from between Lloyd and another one, about immunization one. We can also add in that one as snowmass CT, that part as well. The all Canadian flavor resources or parts, but building block, we add in. And also we focus on small group of resources, make it speed up, or we call it, what's called wrong is called accelerate, what kind of fast, whatever, make it, normalized. With this, setting with those baseline profiling IG in hand, and we're ready for any possible changes. FHIR, they could leverage baseline in a much better shape, or they could either, how to say that, emerge with baseline or collaborate with baseline. That's up to the negotiation process. I just stop here. Thank you.
So I think that that's really pragmatic, Thomas. Like, do you feel like I captured kind of the sentiment here, which is like, if we want to be the most leverageable, there's work we can still do, improving, refining. I think you said, like, looking at that use case agnosticism, gathering details about that implementation, how we are tackling practices, what are the best practices, while acknowledging, right, that some of these decisions about, is it leverage, is it consume, will just have to come when we reevaluate, and that there's really not much more that we can talk about on this front that we haven't kind of already explored. And so we'll just have to wait. Do you feel like that kind of captured the intent?
when you mentioned wait for the feedback from the core, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, because so far I haven't seen any, next step we can do to engage or encourage core plus. So my thought, just stay tuned. That's the only phrase I can use. Besides, I would say, yeah, do what we can do.
Thomas, I would sort of support that because we've done everything we can, and I recognize Sheridan's goal to get us past just talking about it and into moving forward. But I think there's no way to tell what our actions should be until we get more information from
Yeah, I
Core
think that's a
Plus.
fair summation, right? Like as long as as a community we're comfortable with that, I think part of what we've been doing is therapeutic, is like kind of talking through our concerns. But I mean, I'm interested in kind of just getting back and like continuing to make this product helpful for folks.
Well, that's the profiles track, not the governance track, right?
So on that front, I mean, what do the governance folks want to talk about on the governance calls?
That's a good question. I'm intrigued by your next slide.
Oh, this was
lesson call.
just an appendices that we were looking at some of the ways that the nations are reflecting their
Oh, yes,
scores
yes,
and
we talked about that, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, on Tuesday, Joel promised to get us some information about what the current governance structure that's being planned is. So I actually think that
I
Yeah.
did attach that to the post that I just made
to post you just made where?
on HL7 Canada.
Okay,
Forum?
yeah, I'm sorry, I've been on the call, so I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I did it as the call was starting. So
Yeah.
I have posted something. And the
but I think that,
questions that were outstanding, I'm hoping to get answers to those to post next week.
Yeah.
but in answer to Sheridan's question, I think the next time the governance group meets, going through that and trying to understand what's there is probably a useful task. I don't know what others think.
I think that is a useful task. The other thing that I would do, Sheridan, is if you took a pass through the work that you've done, and in terms of let's presume for a moment that their baseline would be a persistent thing. What are the governance processes in terms of as new activity comes on board, as things change, as projects get completed and implemented? What are the governance processes that you think need to exist, that the group would think we need to exist, in terms of the way in which a use case agnostics expression of Canadian, localization needs to be sustained and maintained. And if we looked at it from that way, you can help, because I assure you that the group that comes up with the governance model and then starts to have to activate it needs that kind of tactile, practical understanding of things that they need to be able to support. I think that would be hugely useful.
So like this. This being one of their takeaways from for the next governance call.
Yeah. And I will say, I'm going to second Randy's comment. But in terms of being practical, all we can do is like let's deal with the information we've got, what's coming out, and then figure out how to respond to it.
And I think the information that we've got is also, we're not going to be tossed aside. So it's also about being receptive to that as well. So, I know that that's the fear, but I think we go with what we've heard. And
what we've heard is that we're going to be tossed aside.
I don't know if that's true. Maybe that is what
I would behave as if that's not the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that we should behave as if that's not
absolutely.
the case.
Absolutely.
But I would also agree that that's sort of what we heard.
Yeah. I mean, that's what people are anxious about. They're not sure, but I would suggest to you that in the absence of other information and the knowledge that some of that is not mature, let's continue to mature and
Oh,
leverage
yeah,
what
which
we've
is
done
why I
so far.
suggested the next step is just to take
Yeah.
what's being presented and assess it and make our comments on it and
Yep.
try to go forward in as collaborative a way as we can.
Yep, I think that's a fair, so I'll get it added as a next piece. And, you know, one of the things that we did out of the FAQ in an earlier governance session in February was respond to it. So I think that's another flavor of this, is just, okay, do we have further questions that we want to share or ask for further clarity? So at least, you know, we're trying to collect what those are from our group rather than just sitting with them ourselves. So I'll
Yes.
clean this up once again. I think that's a fair plan for our next governance call on Friday. And
And
I
our next one is next week, right?
correct. Yep.
Okay, and the week after that is HL7.
Yep. And I think that'll be mostly a profiling focus call. So I will clean this up, make it available on the own cloud, and we will go from there. I think, you know, let's just, I love the idea of, you know, we operate off of what we know and we make the best case of it that we can. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a separate question for you, Sheridan, that isn't an
Yeah,
everybody
I can
question.
stop
So,
sharing and
yeah.
save this.
So I went into